Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for this webinar. I'm going to pause just a moment until I see folks come into the webinar, and then we'll go ahead and dive into our topic for the day. Let's see here. Just a moment. Okay, I think people are coming in, so we will go ahead and get started with our session for the day. So welcome to our December office hours. It is that time of the year, cutover, changing fiscal plans, shaking things up in the RevOps world. So we wanted to have this session to help people get some really hands-on advice and tactics to manage this transition. So cutover confidence, hands-on preparation for your fiscal year transition. Let's dive in. So what we're going to cover today, I want to make sure to start everybody off with an easy way to make sure that you know how to find these resources when you need them, if you don't already have them bookmarked, etc. So we'll make sure we go over that. The second thing we'll do is we have a primary asset that we'll be diving into today, and we'll do a quick overview of what its components are. And then finally, we'll spend the bulk of our time looking at what we've called the go live run list and making sure that every line item in that sheet is clear to everyone, and also making sure people have a chance to ask questions as they need to. So that's the big picture for the agenda. Very quick introductions. I will introduce our team, and then if there's anything you'd like to add with respect to the topic today, we'll do that briefly. So Lisa Tijan, she's the manager of our CSM team. Brad Warnock, a CSM. Brian Goodson is an implementation consultant with also a long history of many other things at Fullcast. And then I head up customer education here. Lisa, anything you'd add?
No, I think that covers us pretty well. The only thing I would add is that Brian's almost like our own full cast Swiss Army knife because he's done everything.
That's fair. Awesome. Okay, so as promised, let's dive in. This is our support site, support.fullcast.com. And the primary resource, just for the record for people, if you just search Cutover, I've obviously been to this page a bunch. The Cutover Go Live Run list is the very tactical page here. And so we've got this presented a number of different ways. You can see you can download an Excel file here. The same thing is up in this link here, just putting in a couple places so it's easy to find. And then within the article itself, for folks who want to see more of like just a different presentation of the same information, we have the run list with separation for what happens in Fullcast and what happens in Salesforce for each phase of this process. And so the three buckets are roughly like you need to prepare for this thing and validate that all of the data and inputs and so forth are correct. And then there will be the time when you actually are going to do the cutover. You need to do some lockdown of systems and actually push the buttons and so forth. And then the third phase is turning things back on and making sure that your systems and processes and so forth are working as you intend. So just to come to support.fullcast.com, search cutover. This article has everything you need. The next thing for us is to actually dive into this workbook. So we've got a little title page that shows what the components are. And so we're going to run through each of these tabs briefly here. I see a couple more people entering. Just want to mention, feel free to drop any questions at the Q&A as they may come up, and we'll make sure that we get those asked or answered for you all. Okay, I'm gonna let somebody else take over the introduction to these tabs. So discovery questions, do you want to walk us through this, Brian?
Yeah, sure.
Just the big picture of why there's here. I think Brian or Brad, as we were preparing, I feel bad for not remembering who had the more stronger context on this one.
Yeah, sure. I could speak to it. So one thing I'd want to kind of speak to before we even get into these questions is this pre-question you should be asking yourself of, do we even need to cut over? So most of us have probably already made this decision at this point in time, but as you go into this process every year, one of the things you should be thinking about is a cutover even necessary? Do we even need a separate plan to build in as we're kind of transitioning from one fiscal year to the next? And the things to think about as you're kind of going into this really revolve around how much change you would expect from one year to another. So if you're seeing or expecting that largely your territory structures are going to remain the same, kind of going into the next year, and also if you expect that the people and the assignments from a coverage standpoint aren't going to change very much going into the next year, then that might be a scenario in which you actually don't need to cut over at all. All you would really need to do in those cases are simply extend your existing assignments and remain on that existing plan that you've been on. Again, I think most of our the people that we've worked with are actually going to be transitioning, but I just do want to call that out that this is a scenario that we'll see sometimes where a cutover actually isn't necessary. Um, with that, as we start to just kind of at a high level, and we'll get into detail as we start to show the our next slide here, but timeline, this is very important. You know, as we're kind of going into this, there are a lot of tasks that we're going to call out that need to happen ahead of time or should happen ahead of time, just to give the team some runway in case there needs to be, lockdowns that happen in your Salesforce systems. So we'll go through those in detail. In terms of the data flow, the new metrics, I think a lot of these will actually, it makes a little bit more sense to talk about once we get to that timeline. Um, but Ashley, if you could scroll down, we'll see if there's anything else here that we wanted to call out specifically. Flows, automation, UAT. Okay, so a lot of these I think we'll be covering in that next slide, so we don't want to kind of discuss them twice here. So I
Yeah.
think we can move on unless there's anything else someone wanted to talk about here on these discovery questions.
I think the only thing else I'd highlight is that we kind of add to these every year and we kind of finesse the workbook. So if there's folks who've seen previous versions, that might be interesting to know. And then also, this is kind of like the foundation of what are the things that we need to start thinking about early on. So yes, I think you covered it well there, Brian. The next tab here is a timeline. And the way that this works is we just roughly put the days before go live, you put in your target go live date here, and then we do the math for you. This, I think, when we were preparing, Lisa, you called out that probably a lot of people already have their timeline and that there may be some things are really relative to your organization. But our intent here is just to make sure that we put the phases or items here in a bigger timeline than the actual go live run list. So that's kind of the purpose of this one. Was there anything you'd add to that, Lisa?
Yeah, the one of the biggest things to kind of recognize with this particular page is that a lot of this stuff, it's not things you're doing directly in Fullcast, but each of them could impact what you're doing in Fullcast. And so we try to give a general timeline. However, every customer has an idea of when they're going to be taking these actions, and it doesn't necessarily line up to the times that we have proposed. We recommend that you're looking at these things within these time frames just to make sure you're not getting behind the ball. But every organization's a little different. So this is just meant to be giving an idea of when you should start tackling those things if you don't already have a plan in place.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this takes us to the real meat here. And I think there's a great question, I think, Lisa, that I see you responded to in chat, but I think it's worth a discussion for us as well before we dive into each of these line items. The question is it common for Fullcast to walk through all of the needed cutover items real time together with the customer, or do most customers just do it on their own with little support? Lisa, would you like to speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, so the way I kind of expressed it there is, there's not necessarily a cookie cutter answer for that particular question because different organizations need different levels of support. For example, Jam, I know you guys over at Udemy are still on a custom export, so that adds another layer of complexity. Whereas a lot of our customers that are now on standard jobs, they can take almost every one of these actions completely on their own without having Fullcast standing right there over the shoulder watching with them. But we, at the very least, do want to make sure we're completely aware on both teams, the customers and Fullcast teams, as far as when the actual export, the initial export, is going to be kicked off. We commit to having team members on our side watching things on the back end so that we can ensure no issues are arising. So at the very, very least, we got to know about the export and when that's happening. But there are some organizations that will ask for a bit more support through this, and it depends on if we're doing managed services or what your support looks like at that moment in time. But I would just encourage, if you have specific questions or you want additional help, make sure to talk to your customer success manager here at Fullcast, and we will work with you to find the right support level to get you across the line.
Great. And so now that we've got that framework, which I think is helpful to orient us to what we're looking at here, we really tried to be as discrete as possible with the very specific tasks. And for tasks that it's important to execute in a specific order, they're in that order here, particularly when it comes to the day of like pushing the button type of tasks. So we've got the step here, again, time, which really depends on several factors, but roughly things that are happening as planning on the day of and then as a follow-up would be the kind of buckets there where the action is taking place. If you've got both territories and policies, some things are going to be relevant to territories, whereas others are going to be only relevant to policies. And then the detail of what's happening and any documentation that you would need to follow in order to execute the step. So I think there's one thing, Brad, that you had mentioned as we were preparing in terms of like understanding or considering what the data flow for Cutover is. Could you share your experience and thoughts with that one?
Yes, thank you. So, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So, to Brian's comment when we started the conversation, where he said some people will cut over, and some people won't. They'll just make changes in their existing plan, right? Now, as the year goes by, you may make territory and assignment changes, and the import-export process is relatively simple in the sense that all of your data comes in through import from Salesforce, and all of your changes get exported. And if those changes are not very significant, well, then that data flow is relatively simple and it's not terribly impactful. A lot of people have on their side in Salesforce a flow that may take our account team update and update the owner or custom fields within Salesforce. One of the things that you need to consider is if you do a cutover of an entire plan, so you make a copy of a plan, and now you're actually going to disable one plan and enable another, on that day, the data flow is very different in the sense that all the data that was currently in Salesforce is going to get replaced with the new plan. So even if that copy of the plan is 50% the same, all those assignments are in a new plan, and so that's all fresh data being pushed from Fullcast into Salesforce. So that data cycle is actually pretty significant. And if you have multiple assignments on every account, those are records multiplied by that quantity in the account in the count of data records that get updated. For example, you have 50,000 accounts in Fullcast. If you have 5 assignments, now you have 250,000 updates that are happening in Salesforce. So you need to anticipate that a little bit. And sometimes if you have a flow that is updating the account owner, based upon each one of those updates, you're going to have 250,000 instances of that flow running. We may want to talk through doing a data load for part of it, shutting off those flows, those kinds of things. So this list kind of walks through that process, and the consideration of the data activity on that day is something you'll want to just kind of think through and think about the impacts in terms of volume.
And I think that raises a good point too, because one of the reasons why we included this item is that a lot of the things in cutting over are things that are going to be similar to when you did your first original Fullcast go live. So I wanted to highlight that. And I guess one other thing for folks who are on the call is, we mentioned this previously, but just to be clear, this run list is for the assumption that you are going to be switching between exporting plans.
Right.
So a couple of things that I will actually add is we have a document that actually talks about what is that process for the export job itself in terms of what are the phases. We wipe team members, we recreate team members and so forth. So if folks are interested in that, I can make sure that we share that resource as well. Yes, so good call out there. And I think I don't know if this is what your all's experience has been with advising customers on, do we need to mass update assignment end dates? What are any gotchas that might be there? Is this even necessary across the board?
Um, I would say generally, I've seen cases where this is required. Typically, what ends up happening is that when you set up your assignments initially, you'll see the defaults will either land at the end of the year or at the end of the fiscal year. When you're transitioning from one fiscal to another, you may end up in cases where that transition happens after the end of your fiscal year. So you'll end up with a gap in between your coverage. So what we're talking about in this step is validating that all of your existing coverage roles or coverage end dates are extended beyond where they currently land, and they're at least beyond when you expect to kick off that brand new fiscal year. Otherwise, you'd have some gaps that are in your Salesforce instance for the time frame that the end date ended and the new end date or the new start date would start. So that's essentially what we're talking about with this here.
There are some nuances with this as well in terms of, are we going to like copy the existing coverage assignments and then extend the dates? Or are we just going to bump out the dates overall? Are there any things that you guys think is super important to remember there to inform the decision on which of those methods we use? Lisa, I saw you.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention, as you're considering the mass updates, let's say that you do copy the plan, you're probably gonna want to mass update all of your assignments, right? At that point, versus redoing things manually. But when you're actually going to do the mass assignment update, one of the things to keep in mind is that the filter you set for which assignments you want to mass update is very important. If you don't put the filter on, for example, to look only at the ones that have the last day of the fiscal year as the end date, you could end up bumping out assignments that have already expired in the past. So right there is an example of what the criteria might look like. You could just do it for certain roles, you could do it for certain assignments, but at the end of the day, you want to make sure you're only updating active assignments. And so just be very cautious in how you create that filter. And then that second piece there is just where you actually want to bump the end date to. Notice you can mass update start dates as well. If you are utilizing our targets or quotas module, you will want to update both the start and end dates typically. That way you have the full fiscal year for when those targets are actually applying. But just being cautious about what that criteria is and what you set the end or start dates to is going to be the main call out there.
Great, thank you. Okay, so that kind of takes us through our first 3 items here. This let's see, committing changes. So I think when we were talking about this, the assumption is that throughout the planning phase, folks are going to be, changing rules or changing, moving accounts potentially manually and so forth. And I know that a lot of times we recommend that people commit changes as they go. But is there any additional color for folks to consider when it comes to like how and when to commit the changes that they're making in their plan prior to go live?
I can add a little color here. One of the things is essentially just knowing that changes are not happening as you're about to actually export, right? So we encourage you guys to lock it down a certain amount of time beforehand so that you can be able to actually evaluate the next couple of things that we have in this list, right? To make sure we know those coverage assignments are exactly what they need to be, and to make sure that the policies are put in place. But committing, essentially, you're going to want to have a final commit, and you're going to want to have all of your team knowing that this is the day or time that we are saying everything needs to be done by, so that when we actually start to make the moving pieces actually move, we don't have other things in flux, and it can be a very clean cut.
And when you see your team, just to clarify, this is the situation where you may have multiple people in different regions, for example, managing the car for their region.
Yes.
Person, for example, in coordination with sales leaders and so forth. So there's a lot of cooks to the kitchen, as it were, and kind of getting aligned on how and when we want to commit ahead of the actual cutover.
Exactly. Yeah. So for some teams, it could be the sales leaders that are making these, final cuts. So for some teams, it's the RevOps teams. Whoever it is that's owning changes in the plan, what accounts are going where, what assignments are going where. Just having an end date to say this is when everything is due by is going to help you all make sure that it's very clean moving forward, and just keep everyone on the same page.
And one thing I'll call out here as well is I have this article linked for managing saved views. Um, I guess the caveat I would give there is the commit state, like are things in a proposed state or a commit state, is going to impact how what kind of fields you might want to have in your saved view to help you understand any moves. So I know, for example, that a lot of times you might have a central ops person who is doing an initial carve that they can then commit everything. And then as your regional teams go through and make their changes, those things would be in a proposed view, in which case the comparison of current versus proposed is super helpful because current is what the central ops team did and proposed is everything that maybe regional folks have changed. And that's kind of the call out here to use this review proposed changes saved view is stemming from that assumption that that could be a workflow that you would use. So I suppose my point here is saying that if that's not exactly your workflow, then you may want to consider another view that would help you achieve what you need to do in terms of understanding the changes that you've made. Okay, so the next one here, validating coverage assignments. We talked about coverage assignments previously in terms of like the assignment end dates. This one is really just looking for coverage gaps. And so the link here is about how do we create a coverage gap and make sure that all of our territories are covered. Any gotchas or points that you all would call out when it comes to just double checking all the coverage assignments and so forth?
I think a lot of the kind of the guidance that we gave on the prior step about just generally committing all of your changes also really ties in here. As you're committing these changes, really we're also committing these accounts to territories and the owners, by extension, should be assigned to them. Um, I'll say that if we are making changes to the roles that we're going to be pushing into Salesforce from year over year, then making sure that we have the exporting flag enabled on those roles is set is an important step. For context, there are different flags that you could have on the role itself, and you could either enable or disable these roles for export. So if we were, for example, bringing in SDRs this year and we weren't tracking them prior, we'll want to make sure that that flag is set. Otherwise, when we push them all to Salesforce, we won't see that specific role in the account team.
Yes, that's a good call out. And there's that line down here for as well, but it is important to think about that when you're setting up your coverage, like even if you haven't yet set up that flag, which ones am I going to be exporting and making sure everybody's aligned on that to make sure that there aren't coverage gaps. The other, I had a thought come to mind, but now it's escaped me. If anybody else has thoughts on that one, let us know, else we can move on to the next one. Or maybe my thought will return to me. It's not coming back. If it comes back, I'll let everyone know. Okay, so the next one here is specific to if you have policies. So if you've got routing, account routing, lead routing, holdouts, whatever the case may be, your next step here is going to be making sure that the policies have been created in the new plan. And so again, the underlying assumption here is that you have your current fiscal year plan, you've cloned that plan and started to make changes to what your new plan will be. And in the process of making that clone, we're checking to make sure that the policies were successfully cloned over and so forth. Are there any tips or shortcuts or tricks for people to make sure that they're able to validate that the policies have been created in their new plan?
I can just make a comment there. As you switch plans, your routing policies or your policies are actually going to be talking to a different plan so that you will need to validate that they're enabled. That's relatively straightforward, but that's really why we added a little bit more UAT commentary to the discovery area too, to think through, okay, everything that I have functioning today obviously needs to still be functioning perfectly once we flip over to the new plan. It's not difficult to validate, but this is a good place to make that list of all right, I'm actually going to establish a full UAT plan to make sure that everything that was functioning previously is functioning again and that it's been fully enabled. So that's the only comment I'll add there, and it sort of jumps ahead in our conversation. But it's pretty easy to go and invalidate those. You just want to make sure you actually run them to make sure you have some test accounts and leads flowing through policies as needed.
Great. The next two here are, as we were preparing, these are kind of gimmies a lot of the time. Like, okay, it's probably not new knowledge for any seasoned Salesforce admin that these things are important to do, but we wanted to include them here. And for the same reason as previously when we were talking about the volume of an export, if there are downstream automations associated with the Fullcast account team export, it's important to consider, do we need to disable those? And then also backing up your account data is a no-brainer as well, but we figure those were worth including. And then, okay, so these next ones are important. These three are kind of on their own little one item, but the order here is important in terms of, so we have our exporting go-to-market plan. That's like our today plan. So we're going to go and we're going to actually click disable export on that one, right? Then we're going to go to our new plan and click enable plan or enable export on that plan. And we still haven't exported yet, right? And then we're going to enable our roles for export. And Brian, this is what you were talking about. And so we're doing all of this. And then our next step is to simulate. So in terms of getting this flow right or anything that's important to call out with respect to each of these line items leading up to the simulate, what would you all call out here?
One tiny thing, just because I know Jam is on the call, the enabling and disabling of plans for export with a custom job, it is handled with our support team, so partner with us. For everyone else, it's not always just a singular plan. Sometimes you have multiple plans that are exporting. And just note, you may be cutting over with just one plan, or you may be cutting over with multiple plans. But the idea is that anything that you want to stop actually talking to Salesforce, make sure to disable that. Anything that you want to begin talking to Salesforce, make sure that's enabled. So just keep in mind that it may not be singular. Same thing with the roles. You may not push every single role that exists in Fullcast over to Salesforce. Commonly, most people don't. It's usually only a small handful of roles that you're actually having Fullcast manage and push to, the account teams, for example. And so just keep in mind that this could be nope, Jam, I got you. Keep in mind that this could be lots of clicks, or if it could be just a few. So it really kind of just depends on what you guys are doing there.
So the articles that are listed here about the plan export, where do I actually go to click on or off for exporting, as it were? And then the same thing here for your roles. And a couple other things that we had talked about is like, we have day of listed here with the assumption that this is like going to be the equivalent of, okay, we're cutting over. If cutover were a single button on a single day, this is the group of tasks, and that would be the timing. But I think, we did discuss the possibility of folks maybe wanting to have a longer period where they aren't exporting. If anybody is considering that, what would you call out in terms of can I, what might I think about if I wanted to have a longer period where I'm not exporting, where I kind of have a freeze? What are your all's thoughts on that?
It's really, organization by organization, but I would say if the current assignments or the current individual or territory that an account is assigned to is playing into any decisions that are being made in the new plans carving, then this becomes extremely important, especially as you start to do things like smart plans and, balance by um, things that are minimizing disruption based on things that are in people's names. If you're making changes on the existing plan, then that might throw the minimized disruption in the new plan out of whack. So just spending time to carve or planning to spend time to kind of have a lockdown period is just generally a good idea if you're going to be building with smart plans.
Yes. that was the thing that I thought about back here. I'm glad you mentioned that for validating coverage assignments, because like what if somebody used a smart plan for initial carve of that a group of a set of territories, but they hadn't assigned people, so they need to now go back and assign people. And then this is a kind of a side tangent, but presumably uh if the flow was carve with a smart plan, maybe you're using a minimized disruption, that's important, but you haven't yet assigned the reps to the individual node. After you do your coverage assignment, your next step would be to rerun rules to kind of activate that minimized disruption, as it were. Is that right, Brian?
Yeah, that's right. The minimized disruption expects and relies on an assignment of a specific role to happy in that specific territory. So you can create the smart plan without that person there, but if you actually wanted to adhere to the smart plan, the minimized disruption, you're going to want to make sure that there's a person there.
Great, thank you. I'm glad that came up.
Yep.
Okay, so once you've done all of this, like flipping of switches to make sure the ducks are in a row, as it were, we have this step here of simulating export. And so this is where you essentially run a job, but instead of pushing these records into Salesforce, as it were, it generates CSVs. And this is also where it becomes important to understand how Fullcast export job, and again, this is a standard export, how the standard export job works in terms of, it has a delete phase first and so forth. And so when you run this job, you're going to get like a bunch of CSVs that you can then go and check to kind of get a sense of, what actually is going to happen if I were to run the export now. Any tips, considerations that you all would share with people as they go to look to run this simulation?
I think the only thing I'd mention there is for sure don't skip it, right? Because that's your first indication of what the export will look like in mass, right? So it may seem like a simplistic task, but it's a really good validation point to make sure that you have roles, everything enabled, everything set up as is. That's your last moment to validate all the record schemes that will hit Salesforce. So it's relatively straightforward, but I would, establish whatever quantity of accounts or assignments you want to validate in order to feel like I've hit a good variety. It all seems to be here. It all seems to be accurate, right? But sometimes people are a little bit tempted to bypass it.
That's a great call out. And I think I'll be completely transparent when I run a simulate export, just because of my real life is not everyone else's real life. It's a lot of files to look at. But I think for me, one of the very first simple things to do is to simply look at the volume of records, because when you run the simulation, you're going to get a preview page where it's going to show you here are all the files and the number of records in each file. And that's like a first gut check, right? So like my Salesforce delete job is going to include 8,000 million whatever records. You can kind of sanity check, like, okay, does that make sense that I think this is the number of records that are going to be deleted? This is the number of records that are going to be created. When I open the account team export, which is probably like the one that that's not the most important. They're all important. They all have their job, but the account team member export is really like, these are account team members. Everybody is looking at account team members, maybe more so than the custom Fullcast records. And so that's a great one to check and just look line by line or spot check. Maybe you do a random, check of the records and so forth. Okay, simulate. Great point, Brian made. Don't skip it. It's a great call out. Okay, so then we're going to run the export. We call out here that it's a migrate all being that we're going to treat this like it's net new. It's going to make sure that we do all the cleanup and so forth. Are there any like gotchas here? Anything that might be confusing, or is this pretty straightforward?
It's pretty straightforward. I would say as this is happening, you'll want to monitor Salesforce just to make sure there are no errors that you're seeing on your end. Also, you could monitor the job from the Fullcast side as well. If you click the eye icon next to the export job itself, you'll kind of see the stage of the export that it's in, which object it's uploading to, etc. So, yeah, it's pretty straightforward, in terms of what to do. Just make sure you monitor as you go ahead and do it. And I see that now we have it as a step right underneath. So.
Yeah. So this is the statuses of the job. This screenshot kind of shows, but you're always going to see the status here in this column. And then one thing just to call out, because I know it can be confusing if it's your first time actually clicking the manual export button. So this is the import export button, right? And then it takes, it can take a little few moments before the line for your job that you just kicked off shows up here. And so give it a second, and then you can either refresh your page or click the little refresh button here to see the actual job that you kicked off show up in this table. And the little eye icon, Brian, this is what you're talking about here in terms of monitoring the status in a little bit more detail, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Brian, does it make sense to call out the ability to control batch sizes as well? That can sometimes be something people would want to keep an eye on.
Yeah, that is a good call out. So, batch sizing, you could think of the batch size as how many records we push at the same time to Salesforce as a part of a single transaction. Now, typically, this isn't something people will have to make changes to. It should just work out of the box. But if you do have a lot of processes that you're running on top of your account object or any other objects that are going to be touched as a part of this process, there's a chances that a large batch size would result in a timeout on the Fullcast, or excuse me, on the Salesforce processing side. So if that's something that you're seeing was where you're pushing data back out to Salesforce and you're having timeout issues, then reducing the batch size is typically the first place you can go to try to address that.
Great call out.
Mhm.
I thought I saw somebody else start to say something.
I was just going to mention that is you can control those settings in the import export part of your configuration screen. So there are some settings there. Reach out to your Fullcast team though. We're happy to walk you through that if you need to actually get into the batch sizes and things of that sort.
Yes, I'll add a link here to that as well. But yeah, great call out. Yeah, so we're almost there, right? So you kick off the job, you're monitoring the job, troubleshooting. A lot of the times, this is from a Salesforce perspective for the reasons, Brian, that you just mentioned. And then finally, we're in the home stretch, right? Where if you've got policies, after you've run your export, things are looking good. That's when we enable our new policies and disable our old policies. What would you all add, I guess, or say in terms of the order of this? Does it matter that I'm enabling policies in new plan and then disabling policies in old plan? Any things that you would emphasize to folks when they understand this order or they think about this order?
Um, no, I mean, I would say definitely do it in this order, but it wouldn't necessarily break anything if you do it in reverse order. Just
This is kind of like a fail safe, right? So that there's always some policies that are active so that
Exactly.
we're making sure that if new records in between the time when you're doing one click and another click, if a new record were to be created, you've always got an active policy that's managing those records, as it were, right?
That's right. I mean, once we've moved to another plan, we've disabled it for export. It shouldn't pick up the old policies, but this just in case, this is a good way to go about doing that.
Great. So the last one here, this seems a little bit vague, but I'm sure there's a reason. I'm trying to remember, we've updated this recently. Performing our validation process, what does that look like? What does that mean? I know this, I think, Brad, this is near and dear to your heart. What would you emphasize here?
Well, and I think everybody's got, well, I think the object here is I would probably add to this list whatever is unique to your validation process, right? So go through and make sure that you have, a varied set of assignments that have been properly validated, that they're appearing correctly and dated correctly. Make sure that the territory assignments are working correctly for the accounts. Make sure the account teams are all showing correctly. Make sure you're not only that your policies have been enabled and disabled, but that you fire a few examples of those, right? So if you have routing or lead routing or anything that you might use policies for, that all of those things are functioning properly. And usually we would tell people to grab a few or a handful of a varied instance of any one of those items to go through and just spot check everything. So whenever we do a cutover, we'll usually build a defined list, even use account IDs or whatever we want to do in order to go through and validate that data so that we know that everything has shown up properly on the other side after the export. So again, this is just kind of a double check. It seems a little bit benign and most everybody does it, but I usually encourage people to get pretty organized in the process and make a list with IDs, make sure they understand what they expect to have happen and record what did happen. Therefore, you have a very clear pass fail and a very good way of responding back to us if there's anything we need to work on or review, right? So that's a full paragraph on one line item there, but hopefully that helps.
No, that's a great call out too. And I think it's just a reminder that we're aware that our tasks here are very full cast centric, but this is one piece of a bigger motion that your entire organization is going through. And so we want to make sure that we help support that while also understanding that, from your perspective, this is one piece of your overall, a big transition for your organization. So I think that's a great call out.
And
Um,
that's a good call out, and I'll add something to that because I mentioned all the things that I would expect that Fullcast would have done, right? But you have a lot of internal processes, whether it be reports or territory reporting or other things that are happening in Salesforce that are a result of that Fullcast export. And so I would check all of those things too, right? Make sure that your leadership reporting that everything's working properly across the board. In fact, we did a cutover the other day that had a little bit to do with routing, and they had fields that are completely unassociated with the routing process, right? But once they validated that that reporting was there, we needed to go back and make sure that we added those fields into the routing process to make sure they were properly populated. Had nothing to do with the fullcast process, but it was part of their internal process and part of our validation. So good point.
Awesome. Great. We're almost up on time. I just want to encourage folks, if you have any questions at all, no dumb questions, we've got the Q&A box, or you can also use the chat box. So feel free to drop questions in there for us as we get kind of towards the end here. I will just show also this issues and questions tab. Again, the whole workbook is meant to be comprehensive. I think, like we said at the beginning, different customers use this in different ways. So if it's helpful with your CSM during check-ins to keep track of items here and have status updates and so forth, we've included this tab as well. I think that's pretty much it. I guess if there's any tips or last parting thoughts that our team here would like to share, please feel free to do that as we see if any other questions come up.
I think overall, I just want to emphasize, guys, that this is a partnership, and we're here to work with you through it all. So, if you get to any part of this process and you have questions or you need a little bit more assistance, utilize your Fullcast resources. We want to support you through that. And then, Jim, is there a better way to navigate reporting on policies as the names and IDs change? Let's look at that. Jim, let's look at that together. I think right now the best way to report on policies from what we've seen is out of Salesforce directly. Brian, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But within there, you should be able to see all of the policy names, all the policy IDs, as well as which policies are active or disabled. Brian, any other context you'd add there?
Yeah, I'd actually be kind of curious, Jam, to understand the kind of reporting you'd want to do on the policies. So we get the reports with IDs, then we plan IDs change. The IDs. Which IDs are we referring to when we're saying that the plans and IDs, the policy IDs? I see. Um, okay, I think it might be better for us to kind of have a one-off with that one. It sounds like we might have to get into a few details there, but
Yeah. Jam, let's make sure we cover it on our next call.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining. And I guess Brian or Brad, if you have any last minute thoughts, feel free to interrupt and let me know before I do my official sign off. Brad, I saw you come off mute.
No, I think the only thing is, so and you said it, we've provided this workbook as a template. So use it as you choose, but it's always better to have a documented process, right? Most people pursue that. Sometimes we'll find people that once we have this list, they'll just work their way through it. But make sure you list all of your questions, any concerns, anything you need to think about, put it down on paper, and then we can get it addressed. So thank you.
Great. I will email out via the Zoom mechanism that got you here today. I'll email out the recording at a minimum, and then hopefully I'll have the chance to repurpose this into an article with some tips as well. So expect that either tomorrow, or if the time doesn't, if it doesn't happen in that time, we'll get out to everyone within the next week or so. Thank you again for coming. Have a great day, and I think you'll be in touch with the team as we move forward in this season. Bye. It always takes me a second to figure out how to close the webinar.